All right, so Keith has spent a good bit of time telling us lots of really great stuff to help us understand what makes sermon discussion good. When we walk away from our MC gathering that night, what determines if we say, man, that was really good, or man, that was really terrible. And he's also given us kind of the context that we should have in our minds as we think through questions beforehand, as we're developing questions for those of you who write questions. And he's also given us the context in the middle of conversation of what we think through as we're developing follow-up questions and things. What I'm going to take us through here, really to wrap us up, is just some of the common types of questions we ask. So we've looked at the context and all, but how do we, when we kind of go through coming up with questions, what are we actually asking? And what are some of those different categories of questions? Some of the questions we may ask in the beginning or towards the end of discussion, or what are some of those follow-up questions that we may ask? And as we do this, remember, this is not just for sermon discussion within our MCs. These are questions you can ask and think through as we're just having normal conversations with people, as we're trying to bring the gospel into conversations with our friends or coworkers. These are things to think through for those as well. So I'm going to speak about this in the context of MC discussion, but keep that in mind. These things are for just normal conversation as well. So when we talk about questions in MCs, there are generally three types of questions that we find in MC sermon discussion. Closed questions, limiting questions, and open questions. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about each of those, not long. And after I talk about each one of those, you guys in your groups as tables are going to come up with three closed questions. And then when I talk about limited, you're going to come up with some questions for limited type questions and so on. As far as closed questions go, we want to try our best to completely eliminate closed questions from our MC sermon discussions. And as far as limiting questions go, we really want to be sparing with these. We really only want to use limiting questions to lead into an open question. So closed questions, the first one. Closed questions are just yes, no, factual questions. These are questions that they always are going to give the answer that I expect. A closed question is as simple, not in sermon discussion, but it's as simple as, what's your name? I know Luke, he's going to say Luke. There's no other way for him to do that other than tell me his name is Luke. There's no other option there. There's nowhere else we can go with that. As we look through, let me say this too, as we go through these, use that passage we talked about earlier. We're going to look at Acts 2, 42 through 47. So when you're coming up with questions as a table, use that as the passage that, say, we preach through on Sunday that you're going through. So an example of a closed question from Acts 2, 42 through 47 would be something like this. This is one that I would say would be a closed question. So Luke says in Acts 2:45 that the early Christians were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to those in need. Is this really something we should try to do? Says it, right? They were selling their possessions and giving to those in need. Now, you could think about it a little bit and say, do I need to sell everything I have? No, maybe, probably not. But the answer to that question is, it's yes or no, and the text just says to do it, so the answer is yes. And there's really nowhere else we can go with that question. It's just simple yes or no. There's no room for conversation. There's no room for thought. Even if I'm using that question to plan and planning to dig deeper at a future point in discussion, that question allows no space for anyone in the MC to even start thinking about that concept of selling possessions and giving to the poor, because it was just a very simple yes-no question. So closed questions always fail at self-discovery. They always fail at learning and teaching, which Keith has mentioned. When we're learning, when we're teaching others, we're we're jumping way up on that chart we looked at earlier. We're really starting to understand things, but these closed questions allow no opportunity for that. So spend a couple minutes, 3-4 minutes with your tables, look at Acts 2, 42 through 47, and come up with 3 or 4 closed questions that you would ask from that. And then we're going to bounce around at each table, can just share 1 or 2 of them.
Hello? One question was, should we pray?
All right. That's good. Lots of discussion. Yep.
Should you share things with one another?
One of our questions was, did God get glory from the way the early church was gathered together?
So what were the 2 results of all the actions of the early church?
Yeah, that's good. There's, again, just factual. Yeah, it's like trivia night.
What did they devote themselves to?
And even that one, it doesn't leave us, even that, it's not technically a yes or no question, but all that is doing for us when you ask that, all somebody can do is just go down those verses and name off those things. Pray together, sell their possessions, spend time together, go to church together, attend the temple together. That's all they're going to do. Wow. What?
You just took my question.
Oh, that was their question.
No, it wasn't. Should we spend time together over meals?
Okay.
That was our question. Do we, as a community, do all of these things?
Okay. And we'll get back to that one, because that is a factual question and not a good question, but it's on, we'll get there. That's on the right track towards at least thinking, because it's a little more introspective, like looking at ourselves. Do we do these things? But we'll look at a little bit better way to ask that question. But again, all of those questions that you guys there's no room for discussion. It's right or wrong. It's just a very simple question that allows no thinking for any of us. So the next type of question is a limiting question. So again, I said this earlier. We don't want to eliminate limiting questions, but we only want to use these limiting questions to lead us into an open question, which we'll talk about in a second. But a limiting question is a type of question that limits the available response to a specific source or to specific answers. So an example from this text of a limiting question would be, according to Acts 2, 42 through 47, what are some of the things Luke says the early church devoted themselves to? So this is the question that they used back here. There's not a whole lot of area we can go with this other than somebody going to the text and just naming off all of these things. So even this type of question is not one we want to use often unless I'm thinking, all right, after I ask this question, I know what I'm going to get here, because there's nowhere to go other than the text and give me these 7, 8 different things that the early church was doing. Unless I know where I'm going next with that, that question is essentially worthless as well. Because the answer to this question is limited to Acts 2, 42 through 47, and it's limited to the exact wording from this text. We may change attending the temple to joining or gathering with our church on Sunday mornings, but there's nowhere else we can really go with that. And unless the only way we can go further with that is if there's a disagreement on the actual text. The only way is if somebody looks at that and says, well, I don't really know if that's true. I don't know if we should be praying more. That's the only time we're ever going to get more discussion from that type of question. So there's really not a whole lot of good that comes from a limiting question. So I want you to spend a few more minutes, come up with some limiting questions from this, and in a minute we're going to look at these limiting questions you come up with, and we're going to get you to turn them into open questions. So don't go there yet, but spend just a couple minutes coming up with some limiting questions from this passage.
Okay. What were the characteristics of the early church? Is that open? Or is that limited?
That's a limiting question,
Okay.
which is good.
Awesome.
I mean, that's what we're
Thank
going
you.
for.
Awesome.
That was just the one I came up with too.
Oh, was it really?
But it's all right.
Okay. Well,
It's fine. It's all right.
we weren't paying attention.
It was very limiting. We've already talked about that one even. It's true. Yeah. It's a good question, guys.
Ours was, you hear me? Ours was, what did they have in common? So, pretty much the same question, but kind of
Yeah.
different.
Okay, similar. Go ahead. All right. Only up from here.
What was the result of their fellowshipping together?
Okay, that's good.
What are some of the things the apostles were doing to create a sense of community?
And I would say even the question, should we pray, is somewhat limiting because the passage pretty clearly says yes. I mean, we could debate back and forth, but that's limiting, but it could be made better.
Yeah. Hey, don't forget, I forgot, we've got the Peak MC huddled up at the sound booth back there. So.
What does the text say they did as a community in verse 44?
Good.
What did God do for the first church?
Good. So all of those questions, limiting questions, very specific towards this passage, and again, not much room for discussion here. One thing Keith mentioned while you guys were writing and reminded me of this, there is a place for this type of question. It's not going to get us to the gospel typically. It's not going to uncover areas of unbelief in our life. But these kind of questions do get the group thinking in the beginning. So if I ask that type of question, if I ask what are some of the things Luke says the early church devoted themselves to, people are going to answer that question, and it gets people started talking at least. So there is a place for that type of question, but typically there's nowhere else to go after that question. There's nowhere deeper we can go very easily with that one, and it really doesn't allow people to think very much when you ask the question. It's a pretty simple answer. So while those have their place, typically what we want to go for is what we call open questions. These are the majority of the questions we ask. We want to be this way. Open questions, they don't assume a specific answer. They allow the hearer to open themselves up to reflection. They allow the hearer to look at their own life and kind of think through these things. As Keith mentioned earlier, when we're asking questions, we do want to have in our mind, like, all right, when I ask this question, so-and-so, they may say this, or the group may respond this way. So in that way, even open questions, we're expecting certain answers, but these questions don't demand just one factual answer. There's multiple ways we could go at it. So these are the type of questions we want to employ most often in our sermon discussion times. These open questions, they will cause a person to think lots when we ask these. Hopefully, when we ask these questions, they learn something about themselves as we're going deeper in conversation, as people are discussing the question. Hopefully, people are being able to see areas in their own life that they're failing to believe the gospel, or failing to live as in this text, failing to live as the early church was living. So one example of an open question from this text would be, from what we see in Acts 2, 42 through 47, what would it look like for our MC to live in community like the early church that Luke described here? We're specific to this text, but it gives area for us to say, all right, let's look at our MC. Let's look at what do we do to live out some of these things, and how could we do a little better in that? There's a lot of different ways you could go when I ask that question. Lots of different thoughts can come up from that. But within open questions, I want to break these down a little further because there's all kinds of different open questions that you can ask, and they're not always just the first question. Like, when we come up with questions and post them to the Facebook page, it's not just those. There are follow-up questions that people will ask, and hopefully not just the leader. Hopefully other people within the group as well are asking follow-up questions to people. So I want to just go through 4 of those for you real quick and kind of explain those. The first of those is what we call an adjoining question. So an adjoining question is used to explore different aspects of the problem that maybe we ignored in the conversation so far. So an adjoining question could be one like, how would you apply these community principles in your own life? Or if we committed ourselves to these characteristics that Luke mentioned, how would your relationship with your spouse or your children be affected? These kind of questions help us a lot of times because I know for me personally, sometimes I get so focused in on finding sin or finding unbelief or something like that I'm like so laser focused on that I forget about asking more questions, like exploratory questions that can maybe help somebody think a little deeper on something. Sometimes when we attempt to or want to sound like an authority on a topic as well, we don't even go to these next questions. Like we don't press that question of, hey, what would our MC look like if we did these things? We don't take it a step further and say, for you, what would it look like in your marriage for you to live out some of these things? How would that affect that relationship? Or how would that affect your relationship with your children? Because either I don't want to ask that question because I don't even really think about it because I'm so focused in on what is our MC doing. But a lot of times we just want to sound like an authority. And so I have all these thoughts in my head about how I want the discussion to go. I'm not even thinking about the person, the people that are sitting in the room, when there's really a lot broader understanding of the topic that we could have with some of these follow-up questions. The next one is what we call a clarifying question. So these, just like what it says, they help us better understand what somebody said. Sometimes people get super cryptic in MC discussion, and they're just talking, or they forget kind of where they were going, and so they just ramble on. And by the end of it, everyone's like, I have no idea what that person was talking about or how that applies remotely to what we're saying. And as leaders, we can't just come out and say, I have no idea what you're talking about. We have to have a way to kind of ask that in maybe a little nicer way. Unless it's Brewer or somebody like I know, or somebody I may look at him and say, I have no idea what you're talking about. But a clarifying question could be one like, hey, can you tell me more about that? Or, hey, when you said this, what did you mean by that? Anything like that. Hey, why did you say this way when you said that? It just allows us to narrow it down a little bit and maybe gain a little bit of clarity on somebody who wasn't making a whole lot of sense, maybe. These clarifying questions, I don't think we ask these a lot of times because we have already in our mind made assumptions and filled in the missing parts ourselves. So when I ask these questions, I'm not really thinking about, hey, what did you really mean by that? Because I've already come up in my mind what you meant by it, and I've already determined what you were trying to say sometimes. So sometimes we don't even get to those follow-up questions, but we really have to do that sometimes because just doesn't make sense a lot of times. The next type of question is a funneling question. So a funneling question, we use these to take a topic or what somebody said. We use these to take it deeper. So we ask this type of question so that we can be able to understand, like what was their thought process. Sometimes we use these to challenge some of those assumptions that we've made in a question, or even to get to like the root cause of a problem. A funneling question could be one like, hey, how did you come to that conclusion? Or why did you think that? So we are taking what somebody said, which is a broad thing, and we're funneling it down into, all right, you said this and this and this, but what are you really not believing here? Or what's really keeping you from like take Whitney's, what she said earlier about prayer, like a funneling question is asking that next thing, say, hey, what's really keeping you from praying during the day? And that was one of those questions that Keith, and there's areas where we can really go further. And so when Whitney was talking about it, challenging assumptions about what she thinks about God and how she maybe is not seeing Jesus as a personal friend, like Keith said, and we can use one of these funneling questions to get us to that point. The last one is an elevating question. So elevating questions raise broader issues. They highlight the bigger picture, so it's just like a big zoom out, basically. Sometimes I know when I become too immersed, like in an immediate problem or a small problem, it gets really hard to see what's really going on, like in the bigger picture of things. It probably frustrates Hannah like crazy sometimes, because we'll be talking about something and we'll get struck on like one like tiny little thing, and we're really not even talking about what we were talking about because we've like chased a rabbit or something. We've got off on like this one really small thing. And so sometimes in those situations, it's helpful for us to ask something like, hey, if we take a step back, like what's the bigger issue at hand here? Like what's really going on? I know we've kind of got off on these separate things, but what's really going on behind all of this? Even something as simple as, are we even asking the right question right now? Or are we even really talking about what's going on right now? Something like that can really just kind of lift our vision up and help us see, all right, we're way off track here. Or we're talking about way too many of these tiny little things when there's a root issue that's really affecting all of these things. Maybe it's pride or something, and if we could zoom out and just see that, hey, pride's really affecting all of these little things, then that would really help us be able to address all the problems. Does that make sense? Spend 5 minutes maybe with your table or so, and either look at your limiting questions that you came up and turn them into open questions, or come up with some new open questions based on Acts 2, 42 through 47. When you come up with these, think through some follow-up questions as well. Like a lot of these, like those funneling or adjoining questions, some of those are just follow-up questions that we ask. So when you come up with an open question, think through, hey, what are some potential follow-up questions that might come after that? And think through some of those too. And then we'll have you guys share some of those.
Check.
Maybe just share one of your open questions you came up with. If you converted a limiting one to an open one, and that's what you're going to use, tell us what you changed in that. And if you have follow-up questions or anything like that, just share some of those.
So the open-ended question, when you have like generous hearts in the gospel, So like when you have generous gospel of things, how are you going to do it? But you would just ask why. So I'm just kidding. All right. how?
Like everyone in the room was looking at you like, huh? That's one of those questions where we need to clarify. Yeah. What did you, Luke? What did you mean by that?
How are we receiving? All right, so in verse 46, how are we receiving the gospel with glad and generous hearts? How are we not? And if we did do this, these are all follow-ups. If we did do this, how would that look within our MC and beyond?
It was a long one. I'm glad you.
Well,
yeah.
okay.
No,
So,
I'm just kidding.
so the question was, how are we receiving the gospel with glad and generous hearts? And then those are going to be mine.
Yeah, that's good.
Our follow-ups.
That's good.
I like the first question better.
Okay. Ours was what keeps us from following the example of the early church.
Okay.
And then the follow-up would be, because you figure it'd be unbelief. What do we do with our unbelief?
Good. Good.
Okay, so we took the limited question, what did they devote themselves to? Teaching and fellowship. So, and then our open question, what are some reasons we don't devote ourselves to teaching and fellowship? We figured, like Keith said, most people are going to say because we're busy. What things are we making more important than the gospel? And then we said, are we using these things that in our lives that we do to share the gospel? So I guess that was our elevating. The first one was our funneling. And then what are some things our MC can do to encourage fellowship and discipleship?
Good. Good. I like this.
One question was, we saw that the people in Acts were giving their money and their things. And so what did they believe about their stuff? Or what did they believe about God that they were able to do that? And then what do we believe if, let's say, we don't give of our things, we don't give of our money, what does that show we believe we get from our money? What do we, security or whatever? And what does that show we believe about God?
Yeah, that's good. That's good because that first one too, I mean, it gives us a chance like to look at the text, think about the people that were there and say, you know, what were they thinking about this? And then once you guys got to that, once you got to figure it out, hey, what was keeping them from doing this? You guys can look, and then he taught it with a second question, brought it to us. You know, what is hindering us from doing this as well? That was good. Do what? The first one seemed like a limiting question to me, like it was more of like leading into you're looking for, all right, what were these early Christians doing, and kind of there's multiple ways you could go with that answer for sure, but I mean generally I think we'd all be like on the similar page with that. What was your second one again?
When we don't give our stuff away, what does that show about us, about what we believe about God, or what we believe about our stuff? So we find security from our stuff. So was that elevating or funneling or clarifying?
I think based on the first question you asked, and then asking that one, that would be like an adjoining question because it follows up on that first one and connects the two of them together. Does that make sense?
Okay, our limiting question was, what are some of the things the apostles were doing to create a sense of community? And our open question was, why is a sense of community so important? And then a follow-up, how do we make this a part of our lives today?
Our limiting question was from verse 45 off of they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all. So we had asked, what are some ways we can help the poor? So then an open question, what's stopping us from being generous? And then even from that, what would it take to change that? So looking at the heart of why we're struggling to be generous, and then even reaching further into the gospel of what do we need to do to change that, and how can we change that?
Good.
Looks like we're a little short on time, aren't we?
Guess we'll just skip this one, huh?
Does anybody else have anything they want to say? I guess a limiting question would be, why was early church successful, and what did they do? And you kind of go through the list of, they sold their stuff, they broke bread, they prayed together, they gave to the need, they gave in need, all those things. But I guess the follow-up question that makes it a little more challenging is, as an MC, if we were having an MC discussion right now, I would kind of pose the question, as an MC, how do you practically do that? How do you, even down to the end where it says, breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people, and the Lord added to their number daily, and attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes day by day. How do you practically do this as an MC? How do you live that out? I guess would be an open question.
Yeah, it's good. So, how do we practically do this? And also, you can take that even further and say, what's hindering us from doing this? Because it's clear that you're saying, hey, we don't do this every day. We don't do this day by day. So how can we do this? But, what's keeping us? What's holding us back from actually doing these things day by day? So those are good. Those are good thoughts. All of y'all's questions. Hopefully that helps you to think through, hey, here's some starter questions that may get the group talking, but here's really what we're going for in the meat of discussion, how we can really get people thinking, and how we can eventually get to the gospel. And hopefully some of these final questions can really help you dig a little deeper with what people are saying. I'm going to give it to Keith. He's going to wrap us up.
Any questions as we wrap up from you guys, just to close out? Bobblehead. What? Anybody? Thank you all for being here. I really, really, really do appreciate it. Great turnout. Thank you for being here, and I hope that it was worth your Saturday morning to be here. And our desire really is to see your missional communities thrive, and to see the people in those missional communities grow, to see you guys grow. I hope that one thing really, really clear, a couple of things, but one is hopefully this was of value to you, so that the next time that we do it, you'll, like I was saying to Andy, really encourage your MC to be a part. I think our next one is going to be on gospel fluency again. Is that right? Where did Caleb go? In the fall? Okay, that's right. Yep. So we'll continue these trainings, though, and our desire is to help you grow, but also to help your MC grow and for it to be of value to them. I hope that not only was this helpful for you as far as what the questions, how to shape your questions, but hopefully how your whole MC should be shaped. And I mean by that, like everyone participating, everyone being a part of leading those discussions. It's not just a single leader. It's everyone participating in that. Adam, yes, sir. Yeah, and that is true. Thank you for saying that, because sometimes I think that just because we say gospel, we feel like, man, we really got to the gospel tonight. We said gospel 13 times. And really, ultimately, we know we have gotten to the gospel when we get to Jesus and not just the word gospel. And how the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus changes whatever it is that we're talking about. So early on this morning when we were talking about community, we know we get to the gospel when we say, ultimately, Jesus died for community. And we are truly brothers and sisters because we share in that, in his life, death, and resurrection together. We are children of God. We know at that point we've not just said the gospel, but we've talked about how Jesus makes us family. Is that helpful? And I think whatever it is, if we're talking about anxiety and fear, we can always go to the promises of God and say, God makes all these promises and God is faithful. And that is good and that is true. But we get to the gospel when we say, we know God is faithful when we look at the cross. And we see in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus just how loving God is, how gracious God is, how sovereign God is. I mean, all of that in the cross. So ultimately, it's not just because we say gospel. It's because we've rightly applied the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus to our discussion. Anybody else? If you have follow-up questions, please feel free to ask me or Caleb, either one of us. We want to help your missional communities become better shaped for discussion. So if there's a way that we can help you guys with that, we want to be able to do that also. One of the things we've talked about a lot today is shared leadership. Our newer missional communities are doing a great job with shared leadership. Our older missional communities, we still have some work to do. And we want to continue to work to see that become a part of all of our missional communities so that we truly are sharing leadership across the table. All right, I'm going to close us with prayer. And if you guys don't mind cleaning your table off, folding the tables up, and we can roll them right over here to this wall, or just somebody go ahead and roll them into the storage over there, and then we'll start setting chairs up and all that good stuff. Let's pray. Father, thank you for everybody who's come out today. Thank you, Father, that they would spend their time with us, and I pray that you would bless them for this sacrifice. It is a sacrifice. I pray, Father, that you would help us to be the people that you want us to be in the church that you want us to be. Lord, one thing that we didn't talk a lot about today is how much of this even applies to our conversation with others. Just listening and asking questions that will lead us to share our testimony, our story, to share your goodness and the things that you've done in our life so that others might come to know you, to love Jesus and follow him, because we desire that as well. Help us, Lord. Help us. Help us to be better leaders. Help us to step up and even help lead. Help us to be the church that you want us to be. Father, our desire is to see our city changed, our neighborhoods changed, our families changed, to see the gospel go forward. So, Lord, as that I know is your desire too, I pray that our efforts would bear fruit by your Spirit, and you would let us see you do great things. In Jesus' name, amen.